Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and the fourth and final episode, an epilogue, if you will, in the series, The History of the Early Printed Hebrew Book. And once again, as throughout the series, I'm joined with Michelle Margolis.
Once again, happy to be here.
Thank you for joining me again. Now, first to mention the sponsor and the impetus for this series was Sefaria. So this episode of the podcast is sponsored by Sefaria. If you've ever wanted instant access to Torah, Talmud, and hundreds of other Svarim, all at your fingertips, fully searchable and cross-referenced, Sefaria is for you. Sefaria is a free digital library of Jewish texts in Hebrew and in translation. Whether you're learning Daf Yomi, preparing a shir, or just looking to explore something new, Sefaria makes it easy to find sources and dive deeper. You'll find Rishonim and Achrayim, Sifrei Halacha, Mefarshim, Chasidus, and more, all on your phone, tablet, or computer, and everything is completely free. Visit www.sefaria.org. That's sefaria.org to start learning today. And also, they don't say here, but if you download the app, you can usually download for offline learning as well. So if you need something offline, you can download their large library for offline as well. And this is actually also relevant because this episode, we're going to get into some of this type, Sefaria-like things. We're going to get into some digital learning. And so, although the title is Early Printed Hebrew Book, here we are. We're going to start off. We're going to talk a little bit about Vilna, about Rum, the Rum press, and some later presses. And then we're going to get into digital. So Sefaria, and then Yitzhak Chachma and Hebrew books and some other, online learning things today, which, what's the connection? I thought this was a very early printed Hebrew book. So, Michelle, I'll turn it over to you to talk about it. I know this is something you're very involved with as a librarian, but, it's relevant because that's print's legacy and impacts we're going to talk about as well, and the connection from the early Hebrew print to today.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they talk about print, the origins of print in the West, at least, that it was a game-changing technology. It was a technology that changed the world. It led to new forms of religion. The Protestant religion is directly based on printing. So not based on it, but it happened because of the printing and the ability to get many, many books out. And you see that also within the Jewish world, just what became accepted and what became sort of standard as what to be learned. It was such a groundbreaking technology, and of course there are scholars who say no, it wasn't. But this is something that's a big conversations, and I've seen this in a lot of places, in a lot of writing over the last 15, 20 years. Is the internet the new Gutenberg? Is the computer the new printing press? Is this the kind of change that it was then? And are we seeing complete and utter, social changes, communal changes, religious changes due to this new technology that we have? So I think in comparison, the printing press is always brought as a comparison in technology to the changes in technology that we see today. So I think it's worthwhile to have a conversation sort of as Nachi said, like an epilogue of how this is impacting how we learn, how we use Jewish texts, how we interact with Sfarim in ways that are very different, maybe similar to how that all changed when printing started as well.
And that's not even mentioning AI and what AI now and using AI as a learning tool. One other thing you mentioned about print, halacha, spread of Shulchan Aruch, the standardization of Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam. This is something that really couldn't have happened without print, and something that happened with print and rising literacy rates and things like that. And obviously, we can leave all that. But let's start off with Rum. Let's turn to Vilna because it's so important in the history of Gemara, really history of printing, really more than anything. We'll talk a little bit about Rum beyond just the Gemara, but obviously that's what's so famous. Everyone still uses today as the basis. The Rum, Slavita Rum, the fight, Slavita not used. Rum is the basis for everyone. Even the Hasidim who pay a lot of money for Slavita Gemara, they use Rum. Everybody, the basis is the Rum Shas. Rum obviously did much more than that. And this is important because Rum, and I think we discussed this in the earlier episodes, discussing obviously you had Sonsino, but then you had Bomberg. Rum's Gemara, which we'll talk about, is based on Bomberg. At the end of the day, the Surah Sadaf is quite similar. It's not.
I think everybody sort of started from Bomberg. So Bomberg did all the heavy lifted. Printers made slight shape variations on the daf, things like that. But when it came down to it, Bomberg had already done a lot of the work for layout. So
let's talk about Rum, which is the press was mainly most of the time in Vilna. And this is a press that many people are probably familiar with, Almana Rum. So this is the Almana Rum, the widow Rum, Devora Rum. who is the granddaughter of the Rashash, Rosh Hashanah. She is the nephew of Ramatzion Shtarashon. Her mother was the sister. So, that was also interesting seeing that, actually, because I think there's this legend or that the Rashash is in the Gemara and Ramatzion in some places because he was rich and he paid for whatever. Well, maybe also because his granddaughter was involved with the publishing it as well. So let's talk about a little bit, if you could tell listeners a little bit about the famous rum press and then how that led to this monumental Shas.
Sure. So I have to say a lot of this is coming from the work of Mati Zalkin and his team who have been working on incredible resources. They went into the archives in Vilna and elsewhere. They found a tremendous amount of documentation about the rum press, and they've been working. There are a few articles that are out. My understanding is that they're working on a book. It's really incredible information that has come out until now. So before Devora was an almana, her husband actually was the owner of the press, but he died very young. And so after he died, the press was sort of divided up from a fiscal perspective, where Devora got 40% and her two brothers-in-law each got 30%. But she very quickly took over. And so she did some strategic work to ensure that she would be in charge of the press. That had to do with who she hired, how she was running the press. And it was a monumental sort of endeavor. The press took up an entire city block. It was not a small operation. They were printing. They had. I don't know the numbers. I want to say dozens, if not hundreds, maybe dozens of actual machines that they were using. They worked with cutting edge presses. So this is at a time when new kinds of printing are coming out. And she, at one point, and this is in the article, but from a talk that I heard Professor Zalkin give a few years ago, where she brought in, there was a new kind of press that was coming from Germany, and she actually brought in German experts on those presses to come to Vilna or Vilnius to teach her staff how to use it. And also all of the other printers in Vilnius came to the RUM houses, to the RUM offices to also learn. So she was sort of running printing in the city of Vilnius, not only within a Jewish context, but she was a central figure, or her press was a central press within a broader context of printing.
Let's talk about the changes and innovations that she enacted at the press, this press that she took over was Yerush, so to speak, because, like you said, the press was established much before, generations before, but although what many people today know it as is Hamana Rum, that's how they know the press, because she really expanded it. She enacted new things with the types of books they're printing, with what they were doing, economically, various different things that she changed.
Yeah, and you find, I mean, for instance, she was printing both. She was printing all kinds of Jewish and secular books. She was printing in Yiddish. She was printing literature. She was printing poetry. She was printing all sorts of things. But she worked with authors. They were like almost like a publisher that we think of today, where if an author came to her with a manuscript for printing, the author had to lay out the money, and they had to prove that there was going to be a good investment in their work. Which is how some presses operate today. You have to come with your whatever.
Many presses,
whatever. I don't think we need to go into it, but we could have a different podcast on modern publishing. But she didn't trust the authors to the point that you see some of the authors are complaining that how come they won't, she won't release my books, that the press won't release my books that I worked so hard for, because they weren't finding buyers for them. It was a publisher again, in the modern sense of the word, in that, unlike in the early modern period, when you would go to the print shop and you as an average person would go and buy the book from the printer, now she was selling mostly to booksellers, to dealers across Europe who would buy, a whole bunch of orders of the book, and then they would sell them locally in their own shops. And again, this is very familiar to what happens today with printing. You don't usually buy directly from the publisher, with, I guess, some exceptions, when they have a sale. And then Nachi will tell you that they're having a sale and you should buy for them. But in general...
obviously publishers today, it's so easy with a website, but even still, a lot of people don't, right? They buy from Amazon or they buy from their local bookstore. Many people still don't buy, I think, probably on percentage-wise, you don't buy directly from the publisher. And there are still some publishers that you can't really. They want you to go to the store. They don't want you to come to them. They want to just easier for them to deal with in bulk orders. But that's one thing that she did. She expanded it that way. As you said, she was printing. Vilna was a hotbed of Haskalah and Lion Judaism. There was a lot of works that she printed. Many Haskalah works were printed. They printed a full set of the Be'er. There was a lot of Haskalah going on over there, and just a lot of different maskilim in Lithuania that they were publishing. She was publishing, like you said, translation of secular literature. I think Defoe and others, like they were printing. And then this is besides for Midrashim, the Buber Midrash, she was printing involved. She was talking to Mekitz and Yadamim, their critical editions, and the Shas, the landmark where they went through was meticulous to be proofread. They used manuscripts. They really did there's a reason why it's so important today. I think they bolded different things in there. They made sure it was just a beautiful title page that everyone still say, Gemaras today still have it, even if it's updated, digitized a little bit. They really made sure that it was, and she really made sure that it was a quality piece of work and that it was really up to standards. In some ways a throwback to, you see the old Venice presses in the early 16th century where they were trying to print critical editions. They were working on getting manuscript where it wasn't just like pumping out some whatever. Like we see a lot of these presses throughout the centuries, just they were just retypesetting it or just shoddy work or whatever. Not this super critical. It really was publishing really groundbreaking work.
Yeah, I have a funny story that's sort of related to the collection I work with, where we received as a donation in the late 1800s a collection from it was 3 collections: Giuseppe Almanzi, S.D. Lowenstein, and Reb Yaakov Emden. So we have some of this farm from Reb Yaakov Emden's library, and in that catalog of the books that came to us from that collection was his Gemaras. The catalog has his Gemaras. So as soon as I saw that, I said, many people know that we have his Torah, his annotated Torah. I've spoken about it in other places. It's an incredible work. But I thought I couldn't lose a set of Gemaras. It's kind of a lot. And so I went looking for them. And then a few years after I learned, I discovered that information, but didn't find the Gemaras. I saw that the National Library of Israel had a whole thing on their website about how they have the Gemaras from Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And I was like, wait, what happened? And in the blog post that they wrote about these Gemaras, they said that they came from the Ram Press. So the Ram Press was around in 1868 when this collection first went up for auction. And what seems to have happened is that the catalog came out before the entire collection was purchased by Temple Emmanuel in New York. And it seems that before Temple Emmanuel Temple Emmanuel is the one that donated the collection to Columbia, before Temple Emmanuel bought it, Devar Ram, or agents from her press, went in and acquired just Rabbi Yaakov Emden's Gemaras so that they could include some of his Pirushim Gemara in their Gemara. And so that's how it got sort of removed from the other collection before it was even bought. So that was that just answered a question for me. So I learned about how they were trying to buy Kisvei Yad of all kinds so that they could have sort of the greatest Gemara with all the best Mefarshim.
Yeah, they do have Haggais Yavitz. You see Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it was his marginal notes. Interestingly, I don't know, probably there's some that have researched this. There are some Gemaras, namely the Vagshal Gemara, that is more additional material. They have it. So I don't know if the Gemaras that what they used and some other ones surfaced, or I'm not sure how that happened. There definitely are some that did it, but mainly the bulk of the Haggais Rabbi Yaakov Emden, like you say, they got them and they added that material. And we know the Rashash obviously was in Vilna, was her grandfather. The Rashash is in there, Matisyo Strashin on some Masechtas, her uncle is in there, and there's others they really put together this besides for adding on the page different Perushim, different Rishayim, different Taisis, they added different things, and they really did a critical job. So that's mainly what they're known for. Of course, they printed many other things, and even later on, the press went on for much later. Siddur Eitzer Tfilas, the famous landmark Siddur Eitzer Tfilas, came out much later. I think in the 1900s.
Even right? into the early 20th century.
Yeah, that's something that was much later, but that's also groundbreaking work, and that was still done by the press after her, much after her.
Yeah, and you find actually that when she died, if you look at the Jewish press and you search for Devar Ram, every single Jewish paper wrote that she died, because she was such an impactful person on sort of the broad Jewish world. More on the Gemara, because, and again, this is from a business perspective rather than about halachic and not halachic, but the Sfarim perspective. She actually created different sizes of the Gemara and different options. So you could get the luxury edition or the like the smaller edition, the cheaper edition or the more expensive edition. Her press instigated the idea of the Chassan Shas. And that was a business idea, like buy your Chassan Shas. That came from the Vilna Press. So these are all things that we have today that sort of are like standard in some parts of Jewish society. That's because, again, of a printer and decisions made by a particular press.
I hope that's been made clear throughout this series, that so many things we do today are informed by printers. I mean, so many things we do today are informed by different things, but the listener by now should be aware that there are many things we do and Svarim that we learn and Torah that we have are informed by printers. And we've gone back to ones that aren't Jewish, like Bamberg, right? And people worked in the press. But, even Vilna, the Rom press is much more recent, but a lot of things that we do, like you're saying, Chassan Shas, different options. But you go into the farm store today, we have this size Shas and that, travel Shas, a Pninim Shas, a Morcheva Shas, this one and that one, all different things in it. This is instigated, as you said, by the Rom press. This is really an innovation. Before that, you just printed the Gemara. I mean, there was different editions, different presses had different things in their Gemara, but it was like we printed the Gemara. Take it or leave it. This is what we have, not by the other one. Like, there was no options there at the press. So there's something very, very important and very innovative for the time, and something that continues to inform us here and today.
Yeah. And I think that the concept of having a Gemara in every single household, a full set of Gemara, that wasn't possible for a lot of people. It's very, very expensive. But because she made cheaper options, it was possible for more people to actually buy a set if they wanted. And then very good marketing. Like, this is what you should do as a gift to your chasana.
Yeah, so this is just a brief snippet on the Rum Press, and hopefully in the future I can do an episode on Rum, because they really need at least one episode here on the podcast more about the press. But I want to ask you about, again, even though it's mainly about early Hebrew printing, we're talking about things that are so important and throughout the centuries. Print. What happens to print in the 19th century? Because the last episode we ended off much earlier, so we didn't really discuss 19th century. What happens? There's a change. Now you always tell me.
Oh, yes.
Is that book before 1800? Oh, it's after 1800? I don't want to see it. So
right.
It's like, what changes post 1800? What innovations are made in print generally?
So you have to remember that the Industrial Revolution is in full swing at this point. So there are many that in the early modern period, when presses were producing books. They're producing hundreds of copies, maybe a couple thousands of copies at a time, but not huge amounts the way we think of today, hundreds of thousands of copies that could be printed at once. And it was really in the 19th century that started to happen. There was new technology in how printing could take place. With linotype printing, you didn't have to reset the type every time. You didn't have to recast the type. It was a lot easier because of technology that was produced then. And so what happened was, because so many more books could be printed at once, the kind of paper that was used, that had been previously used for printing, which was made from rags, it was actually a kind of cloth that was reused. This is when you talk about like the shmata guy, the Jews were involved in the shmata business. Old clothing could be reused for all sorts of purposes, including to make paper. And in the 19th century, there wasn't enough fabric to go around. It was too expensive a process, and it wasn't fast enough. And that's when somebody discovered that you could actually make paper from trees, which is how we make paper today. The thing about trees is that because it's a biological entity, it actually has paper that's made from tree has a kind of acid in it. And that paper deteriorates. So the paper actually self-destructs. It destroys itself. And that's the process of where you see in what people come to me and they're like, I have a very, very old sefer. It's falling apart. And I'm like, so it's not so old. It's from the 19th century. Because that's paper-based. That's tree-based paper, which has this acid in it. And it's a very hard process. Even in modern conservation, it can be stopped. It can't be reversed. And so usually we have many hundreds, thousands of books in the collection that I care for that has, that are made from this kind of paper. We can't, it's so expensive to do anything to preserve it. Usually what ends up happening is we end up digitizing the copies so that it's still accessible, and we remove it from circulation so that you can't touch it anymore.
So what does it mean when you see books today? You'll buy a book and it says printed on acid-free paper.
So that's where they're able to remove the acid from the solution that they use to make the paper. So sometimes it's made from a higher quality paper. There are still fiber-based papers that are made. It's much more expensive, of course. But you would buy that. You can tell when you buy a luxury copy of something, it's the paper is thicker, the paper is nicer. And that's what it is. It's not made from this paper that's basically destroying itself. The fact of the matter is that today's printing, the paper is not as acidic as it was 150 years ago, because they've figured out that that's a problem. But it still is problematic. It's still going to deteriorate faster than, say, a book printed in the 1500s, which is a gorgeous paper. I mean, it's clean. It's very nice.
Yeah, and you see when you see some of like these mass market paperbacks, they turn yellow. Give them like a few years, put them aside, and then they're like yellowing. Yeah. The paper's decaying already
because it's super cheap.
And when
these books are not meant to survive, they're meant for you to like buy for your plane trip and then throw in the garbage when you're done. Like, and that's how they're producing books today. I mean, if you look at the books on your shelves, see how many of those books are just glue slapped on the back of paper and then paper put around it, as opposed to if they have some kind of sewing where you can see individual groups of papers that were grouped together. There's so many different qualities of books.
And this is happening more and more with print on demand. And now we have this with Amazon printing, and you can see the kind of just slapping on the glue and just this, cheap quality paper and so on. But as you say, it's so interesting when people always see an old book and they're like, and I'll show them like, look at this book from the 1500s. Like, wait, what? How is that possible? I think it's two parts. One we discussed earlier, and I've discussed it in some of the auction chatters, because one is that they're so used to seeing old type, just facsimile, and then they take it like the fifth facsimile, like, well, it's a terrible font. No, it's not really. If I show you the original, it's a gorgeous,
right? Because they would just
print.
Copy the same thing over and over and over and over.
And the paper is it's you feel it and you're like, wow. And it's really amazing quality paper, and it looks nicer than paper today because, like you said, it's made of rags. So that's something that changed. But also, you mentioned the word there. If you could explain linotype, what does that mean? What changed? What was the process like throughout the 19th century?
So linotype was a type of printing using linotype presses where the type actually could then be reused. It was melted down as part of the machine and sort of inserted. It's sort of like a precursor to a typewriter, and that's very, very oversimplifying it. But they were sort of getting through these stages of automating a lot of these processes. So just meant that much more could be printed at one time. The long process of setting out the type piece by piece, nakuda by nakuda, was no longer an issue.
So this starts really 19th century, and then this continues. So when we talked about the rum press, how was the rum press printing?
So toward the end of the 19th century, they're already using linotype. But they had their own foundries. Even when they were using sort of old school type, they were melting down and creating their own type. And then they would sell their own type to other presses. So if somebody wanted Hebrew letters, they had sets that they could sell to other presses as well.
Yeah, so really, the 19th century is kind of like hit or miss. You can tell some are acid paper depending on when and where, and some are not. Also, some are, actual old original presses, hand presses, and some are not. You can tell. I have some books, you can feel them, and you feel the bump. You're like, okay, that was a real press. And you see some of them, you're like, no, that was, linotype. Like, you can tell, it depends on the book. You can actually just tell without even knowing. You'll just pick up the book. If you know a little bit about printing, you'll be able to tell right away.
Yeah, and it also depends on where it's being published. So different places are using cheaper or better quality paper, depending on how, the quality of the press, but also sort of the country and what they had access to, things like that.
Okay, so that's really takes us through 19th and 20th centuries. Is there anything you want to mention before we get to digital? Anything else you want to mention, especially in the 20th century with print?
I just thought, it's sort of obvious to say, but I think it's really important to mention, again, people of the book and Jews are like, books are very important and the Torah keeps us going and all of those things. But you see it really strongly in the DP camp. So there was the first Sefer that's printed immediately after World War II on the former Nazi presses is the Talmud. So the Jews go to the U.S. Army and they say, we need Gemaras. We want to be able to learn. And they use this press to create what's now known as the Survivor's Talmud. And it's very poignant. You open the front page and it has an image of barbed wire and it has an inscription to the U.S. Army. It's basically a dedication to the U.S. Army for saving us and thank you so much. And it's really, it's this beautiful sort of out of the ashes moment of they're literally these Jews who have not even figured out what their next steps are, but they still need Torah to survive. It's really a very meaningful piece. The other thing we see is in the DP camps, when they discovered all of these books, when the army discovered all of these books that had been stolen by the Nazis. So again, the Jews in the DP camps said, "You have Sfarim, we want access to the Sfarim." And so there you see in the correspondence of the people who were working with what became the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Project, where they say, well, this DP camp asked for this many chumashim, this many sidurim, whatever it is. And then they get very annoyed because they're not returned. They go to the DP camps and then they're not able to gather them back up to bring them back, because clearly this was something that was so precious that, they couldn't keep track of the sperm that went to the DP camps and that were being used across the camps. So just another example of where you see this like the super importance of books and learning to Jews, even in like the darkest moments.
Absolutely. Let's move on to today. So there's a couple of things to note about today. I'll say some things I want to hear from your perspective on today's printing, before we get to digital and technology. First of all, today, printing, I mean, it's changing, shifting all the time. Probably from when we record this to when this comes out, things will shift and change.
For sure.
Things are just changing all the time. I mean, just talk about recently, I'll work backwards. Like, people are more and more uploading books to Amazon and doing print on demand. They don't have to lay out any money. They don't have to print. Amazon's still just soft cover. Maybe they'll start printing hardcover Hebrew soon. Right now it's just soft cover, but you can print it there. It's print on demand. You don't have to lay out any money. You just, work up a PDF and you can put it there. Obviously, people send around PDFs. That's part of the digital thing. We're going to get to that. But just printing, there are many presses, whether they're real or fake, the press undertakes something and then they get a sponsor from that way, or someone goes to the press and says, here, I'm paying for this and publish this way. And you have, like, say, Machon Yerushalayim, and they do both ways. Some of them might, the project, some of them is initiated by them and they get the money, and some of them, someone says, I want you to print this. All of their, like, Mifal, Teras, Hungary, whatever. So you put on this farm there, you'll see it's just some rich guy said, here's the manuscripts from my grandfather, I want you to print this, and they go and they print that. And they do, job. Now, many of this farm today from a lot of these presses, Mechon Yerushalayim and Avat Shalom and Mosad of Cook and whatever, and so on, etc. Print beautiful editions. They go critical editions. They take the old prints. They have all these. We have this today. It's easier than ever. You see, even 40 years ago, they couldn't really access this. This is going to tie into when we get to the digital, and they would have to. I went around scouring the libraries to find a copy, and I would have to make the and it was like, or you have to buy a Reich. Where Reich went around and he did this beautiful collection. He made these critical editions of the critical edition. They were like
facsimiles.
Critical facsimiles is the way to say it, and so. Today, it's easier than ever to do these critical editions. You can add sources. It's so easy to find them, where the Machaber was coming from, that author of that work. And it's easy you can put in a nice introduction with pictures. You can there's so many things you can do besides for the notes. And you can make indices. So this is really something that's going on in many presses. And you can see there's really a proliferation of quality works. There's also, as always, people just retypesetting things and poor quality work coming out as well. And sometimes it looks nice. It's got nice fonts, got a nice cover, maybe even has an index or whatever, but it's not a good job, and there's mistakes and errors and things like that. You have those as well. And you have so many Gemara options today, right? And we have endless. I'm not going to name companies that we can talk about and whatever. Obviously, Art Scroll, there's a translation of English, using their Shas, using this, again, as the basis the Vilna, and the basis, Bomber going back to Venice. And there are so many different things today in today's print. So today's print is just a lot of different things going on, all different types, all different genres, and more than ever, it's easier than ever to print a book or a sefer. I mean, you could just go, Machon Alei Zayis here in Lego, they print whatever, whoever wants to go, everyone wants to pay for a book. I mean, it's basically self-publishing through a press, so to speak, is what's going on. But,
and again, you get this sense of what was happening in the 15th and 16th centuries, where all of these farm were coming out, and sometimes the Rabbanim were like, wait a minute, that's maybe not something that should, but we don't have the same kind of centralized authority that they did then in where there can be the same kind of.
Certainly we don't. And today there's probably more books being printed than ever in the Jewish world. Just so many things
and
in English and Hebrew language.
It's impossible to even review, what can be, and you think about Haskamas today in the same way. We're like, I didn't really read this book, but he seems like a nice guy. If you actually read some of the Haskamas, you're not getting Haskamas, you're getting like he's a a nice
And that's
guy.
what people want. They're looking for names, right? They're looking for the
Yeah.
Haskamas evolved from this Hasagas Gvul thing to it's just, look, this brand name wrote a letter for me, and you read it, like, that's not a Haskama. That's just a nothing most of the time, but you have this brand name. So that's kind of print today. I don't know what you wanted to say about print in the Sfarim world before we get into digital world.
So you're definitely better about print in this farm world. I'm coming to it from the Jewish studies point of view more. But I do see that there's a lot more that's coming out, even, to make it very meta. The first, I keep talking about how there's a need for, there's a need for sort of an overview of the history of Jewish printing. And the first book to come out and do it was a book from Feldheim. Not that there's no academic press that said, okay, we're going to sit down and just do a basic overview of printing. I think about there's a wonderful children's book that came out. It happened at Soncino about the history of the printing press, also for like a frum audience. So it's interesting to see that coming out now as sort of a renewal in this interest in the past. But I think again, I'm going to leave publishing, modern publishing, and especially Sfarim publishing to you.
Yeah, modern publishing is really a different thing. I have a thought, and I've thought about it and discussed it, but nothing's come of it yet, to do a series on modern publishing, which in the sense of like, what goes into publishing a book? I want to publish a sefer. Where do I start? How do I approach? What do I do? How do I work on it? Notes by hand versus on the computer using Microsoft Word, different fonts, different layouts. How do you choose a name? How do you write the footnotes? How do you lay it out? And so on and so forth. How do you collect the money? How many copies to print? What type of paper do you use? How thick should the paper be? Do you print on demand or do you print it? Do you print the sefer? How do you pick the cover? Colors of the cover? Texture of the cover? There's so many things to do. It's like, how do you write an introduction? Getting Haskamas? Yes, no. What type of Haskamas? Indices? Yes, no. Sources. So potentially, if anyone's interested, reach out to me and wants to sponsor something. I have such a idea and a potential guest. It's a lot, but I think it'll be very helpful. Actually, it's almost like as a guide rather than it's not historical, so it's different. It's farm chatter. It would be more like practical farm chatter. I think it'll be something. It would be very interesting and very useful for a lot of people to really work through all the steps from A to Z. And I have like 40 or 50 talking points. Literally, like there's so many things to talk. How many copies do you print? Right? There's so many things to work through and to go through in modern print. So that's what, and like I said, there's so many presses but more and more, what's nice is they're really using critical editions. I always look for like not what's new Sfarim wise, but what's new in the Sfarim market that used an old edition and went through it. But also, as should have been made clear throughout the series, don't blindly follow the Tvus Rishon also. People have this like tendency to like worship Tvus Rishon. Oh, Tvus Rishon says this, must be. Well, I guess if we don't have the manuscript, so all you could work off of is that first edition that came out in Italy in 1560. So then you're right, you have to give that credence. But obviously you see errors, like you do see there are mistakes, and you see the mistake or whatever it is, and you should like kind of correct it or notate it. When I put out my new edition of Teres Chaim, there were some passages were out of order from the Gemara worlds. I don't know how that happened, so I put it back. I flipped the order and I wrote, in the old one. So I didn't just do it without telling you. You have to tell it, but I said, in the old one it was such. People just want to see parentheses versus brackets. Like you'll see there are errors. Mistakes happen in the press, especially now that we explained how they went around, setting the type, and you'll have a lot of old Sfarim had luach hatoyis. That's what it was. They would go through it, and the corrector would say, "Oops, here's a mistake, and here's a mistake, and here's a mistake, and here's a mistake," or they didn't catch many of them. So, and each sometimes different copies of different things, they're changing throughout the process as they caught it. So. There's much more to talk about modern day printing and modern day Sfarim coming out, but that's like basic, to mention a couple of things. Now, let's talk about digital. This is something you're very into, DH Digital Humanities. What's going on in the digital world? So obviously we have the sponsor of this series, Sefaria. Sefaria is amazing in the sense that Sefaria is free. So everyone could just use Sefaria. You have so many texts. You can download their library, so wherever you are at any time, it works. So there's Sefaria. I just want to mention before we can go into this. You have Yitzhak Chachma, which you can pay for, and they digitize. It's just digitized versions of the book. It's not like the layout. If those aren't familiar, it's not like the Sefaria where you have like it's actually written out on the app or the website. You have alatorah.org, which is trying to be very critical edition, very fancy, if you will, many different, certain version, very different, on Chumash, they have the Merkais Kedelis, they have some other things in there as well. You have HebrewBooks.org, which is a wonderful free resource as well, which is scanning old prints, also old editions, old prints. You have, and so on. There's so many more that I'm sure forgetting. And this is not even talking about AI and what AI is doing and the different AI things that Dicta and others are doing with Sfarim.
Yeah. So I want to highlight a few things. So of course, I mean, Sefaria has, I would say, changed the game as far as how a broad swath of Jews study Jewish texts. A colleague of mine told me that he gets up every morning and reads. I hope it's okay that I'm not going to say who it is. He reads, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Daf on Sefaria, and that's and anybody can access the DAF now because of the way that Sefaria has made it accessible. There's an easy translation. You could see it very quickly. If you're curious about something that's there, you can click on the text and you can move to another. You can look at the commentary. You can move to, the pasuk that the Gemara is citing. You can do so many different things. It's taken this concept of what we call linked data, where you link where you're linking from one data source to another data source in an incredible way. We don't think about, when Rashi's bringing in all of these different midrashim on Chumash, you don't usually go then and find the midrash that Rashi's citing so that you can see it in context. Whereas on Sefaria, you can literally do that. You want to learn more, click, and you can click through to get to all of these other sources. So it has completely changed the way that a person has a capacity to learn Torah sources. And again, I'm going to bring it back to early printing, where they talked about how easy it was now to see Chumash and Mefarshim all on the same page, or Gemara and Mefarshim on the same page, whereas before you had to have 3, 4, 5 different manuscripts to look at one thing. So Sefaria is in a way doing that now in today's day. But I've spoken to people at Sefaria, and they say that the number one critique that they get, and the reason that there are those who say don't use Sefaria, is because it's not the Tzura Sadaf. They're changing things. They're making it look different than sort of the Mesorah. Now the question is, and we don't have to get too far into this, but the Tzura Sadaf again was something that was created by printers. It didn't exist in the medieval period. There was no Tzura Sadaf in the medieval period. So we're sort of moving back to how it was before printing. But that is something that made people concerned because it's very different than how Jews have been learning Gemara for the last 500 years. And so that's, something that can be of a concern. But bringing all of this material in one place seems to be very good. There are, I noticed, sometimes you are missing, because it's all about linking. You don't always have the introduction, for instance. So I always cite this introduction to Maharsha on his introduction to Agadata, where he talks about the errors in print. I think I mentioned it on a previous episode. And when I went to find the exact text, because I was giving a talk about it, I actually had to pull it out in an actual Gemara because it wasn't on Sefaria, because I couldn't find. I would have looked on Sefaria for the text that it was a comment on, and it wasn't there. And when I pulled up Maharsha, it just starts with Maharsha. It could be that has changed since I looked for it a few years ago, but at that time the introduction wasn't actually there because there was nothing to link it to. It was sort of its own piece of a text. So that's something to think about when you're linking. You don't always have. You sometimes miss things. But I think overall, the fact that they're connecting in so many amazing ways, it has been a complete game changer. Something else to look at if you're at Sefaria, and this is again because I'm very interested in the way that people use digital technologies to teach in different ways, is that they have these amazing visualizations. You could see which Sfarim existed at the same time, which like Sfarim of Tanakh. You can see which Amoraim were actually living at the same time. When was this a Tana? Was this a somebody who was before? He's commenting on this other person. Did they actually exist? Like, were they in the base medrash at the same time? They have some amazing visualizations where they've taken the data and they've seen sort of data from these texts, and comparing Divrei Hayamim across the Nevi'im, because Divrei Hayamim covers a lot of different Nevi'im. And what goes where in really interesting ways. So it's certainly worth digging into, I would say. Another thing that I think is really important to point out is you mentioned all of these new sort of critical editions, and critical edition has a different has many different meanings. I think in the academic world versus in the sort of lay world may have a different meaning. But one of the things that has made this so much easier has been Ktiv. The National Library of Israel has a database of something like close to 90% of all known Hebrew manuscripts in existence. So you want to create a new edition of, X work? Sure, go to Ktiv, find all the manuscripts, and as long as you're willing to sit and read the manuscripts and edit them and compile them and put them together, you too can write a book. And a lot of this firm that are coming out in this way, as calling themselves critical editions, are people who are really actually looking at manuscripts and reading them to put out Sfarim that maybe had never existed in print. I think, or existed in print, like with Toras Chaim, that existed in print and then once and then are now being reprinted. So there are so many opportunities because of access to historic texts that sort of did not stay in the sort of general library of what Jews were learning. We're able to add more historic materials to what we're able to access today. Which is very interesting. And also sometimes, you find things that are surprising as well in what was being published at different times.
All great points. I mean, those are all great points. And I mentioned that Meiri that I talked about in a previous episode where one of the editions, there was someone printed it on a Gil. I mean, it's gone, even in the new printed Meiri. So you just go back to print for a second, forget digital online. Just if you don't have the original edition, it's not there. There are things that are missing that I discovered when I was doing my work in Toras Chaim. Just personally, I had to go back to Hebrew books. And also there's another thing to mention, like Hebrew. Why did I go to Hebrew books? Because Yitzhak Chachma didn't have it. They only had the later edition. So even when they have the original scan, they only had the later scans, not the earlier scans. That Hebrew books had the earlier scans. And you go to someplace like Sefaria, they only have, or like Bar Ilan they had the most recent scan because that's the one that you want to use. The new, or they don't have the scan. They actually go and they type it up.
Have the text. The Bar Ilan Responsive Project.
The Bar Ilan Responsive Project. Yeah. Well, Safari, they have the text because you want to learn Toras Chaim, and that makes perfect sense. But like you're saying, there are definitely things that get lost. So you need all these different resources. Sometimes those different things, and what's really great is they all serve a different purpose, and they're all doing different things. As you mentioned, you have that your friend or colleague that gets up and does the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Sefaria for Daf Yomi. The same person, I'm sure, would not do Yitzhak Chachma, or he wouldn't pull out and read Yitzhak Chachma for Daf Yomi. Like, you're not going to go read up there. Sefaria has Hebrew, it has English, it's so user friendly, and it's so easy to use on a phone. It's so different than when you're talking about other tools where they kind of differ. So some have apps, some don't. Ala Torah is really a game changer for those trying to learn, like Request Kedila, trying to learn Chumash, you're trying to learn all the different critical editions they put in, and they do different buttons, it's different colors. It's really cool if you're not familiar with them. But that's, and they have a Shas, but they have some other things as well. So everyone is really different, but like you said, it's important to point out what's missing, and that can be, again, even in new editions, to go play edition of Meiri, that's not there. Things aren't there. And listen, they're not going to do that. They're not going to take every edition ever printed with an introduction by the printer.
It's also copyright. If something's been republished recently, they might not be able to put something up freely.
Right. I'm talking about when it's old, original, but I'm talking about when you buy a printed book, there are things that are lost from the old ones, like when you used to see the old ones, the colophones, or when they used to write at the end, like the printer, you see like the one who did it, like this is the person who did it, and that's not there anymore. It's not saying who did it. So like you lose some of that like real life connection to the work, to the edition. You have to go back to the original. You're not going to find that in a new edition.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. What else is there to discuss?
So one sort of cool, there are some, there are so many projects now that are out there in various different, areas. You mentioned Dicta, that's been working with Jewish text. So how to, if you remember a concept, but you don't remember where it's from and you don't have the exact words, so you can't search something like Responsive Project or something like Sefaria, although actually you might be able to search Sefaria already like that because Sefaria has worked with Dicta. So Dicta has created these sort of fuzzy searches where you could say, I don't remember what word was used for, say, a man. Was it Adam? Was it Ish? Was it, but I put in this quote, and then it's able to look through all the possibilities for that phrase, and it can pull up the phrase you're searching for. This is really useful when looking at things like letters, old letters from, manuscript letters from 200, 300 years ago. Everybody had sort of Torah on their lips. So the way that people wrote letters to each other often included phrases from Torah, from Gemara, from different places. And if you don't know that, then you're like, why are they suddenly talking about this weird, something about a river or whatever? And it's Lashon Sagi Nahar. It's something where you have to understand the context of the language, of the sort of the literature behind the language, the phrases that would have been used. And these kinds of sources. So what Dicta's been doing is really useful for things like that, where you can put in, you're like, I think this is probably a quote from Tanakh, but I don't know it. And you can put it in and they'll be able to identify what it is, even if it's changed, even if the phrasing has changed, to fit the context of the particular letter or sefer or whatever you're reading. There's a really nice resource called Mi Vami that was created a few years ago by Josh Waxman, which actually goes through Gemara and the various people. So who lived that's what I was saying earlier, who lived at the same time, who would have interacted, who was whose Rebbe, so that if you're trying to understand what somebody's Malach learning is, or would this person have actually spoken to this other person, there's some really nice visualizations on that project. If you're looking at manuscripts and you can't read manuscripts, there's an amazing project now that's being led by Daniel Stockel Ben Ezra, who's been working on the project, which is called Midrash. It's a huge multi-million-dollar project to automatically scan and transcribe various kinds of manuscripts in all the different Hebrew handwritings. So there are many, many different handwritings across time, across different places. And now they're training a computer to be able to identify those handwritings and to be able to transcribe them. And that project, the Midrash project, has been partnering with Ktiv because Ktiv has millions and millions of images of Hebrew manuscripts from covering, over 1,000 years of handwriting. So there are so many projects that are literally being worked on right now, some that are older, some that are newer. I always caution when talking about older projects that, there's something called link rot, where you may have heard of a project 5 years ago and you go to the website and it's gone. The technology no longer exists. Flash was a big thing like 20 years ago, and now anything that used Flash is no longer available. There was a wonderful website dedicated to the Rambam and the Rambam's manuscripts, which is long gone. The Jewish Theological Seminary used to have a website that was all of their most precious manuscripts, which I guess I should shout out to their exhibit, which is available online if this doesn't go up when it's still up, which is going to come down. It's at the Brilliant Club, but will come down by December. If you're looking for the most important manuscripts at the Jewish Theological Seminary, that website no longer exists. It could be there'll be a new one coming, but all of these older websites that you may have bookmarked because they had really important resources are now gone. So we're sort of experiencing this huge explosion of technology, and there's so many interesting things and so many amazing things that we can do. And also at the same time, we're losing stuff at an incredible rate. So while there's an explosion of information, there's also an explosion of loss that you need to consider when you're thinking about how you're using things you're using material in a digital context.
Then we also have mentioned there's AI. That's a whole nother thing. Perhaps to do a podcast in the future. There's Dicta, there's Sofer.ai, there's others, all different things. That's a whole new frontier, if you will, that'll be changing rapidly as the world with AI and then AI in Svarim.
And AI, of course, has been taught a lot of Jewish things. I mean, you can ask it to write a song in the style of Uncle Maishi about crossing the street, and it'll give it to you.
Yeah, I know that Dicta's Rabbi AI, RABBAI, they've taught it to write tshuvas, but it's not necessarily. There's different. You can ask many AIs. You can ask ChatGPT, and it can give you, quote to use sources. Not that don't use the Paskin. Obviously, don't need me to tell you that, but you can use it to get sources from it. But what's wonderful about the Rabbi AI, the one that Dicta did, is that it writes you a tshuva in the style of a 18th century tshuva. It really writes a wonderful tshuva with really wonderful wordplay. It's really you can really wow, this is like reading a tshuva, and you just try it, write it a shayla and see how it is. So.
And then bring it to your LOR and make sure.
I'm saying to write it just to see how it writes it, and not that again, not for psak purposes or whatever. But anyways, there's that. There's so many other things, and did we mention Wikipedia, Hebrew and English? You're trying to learn the history, and the Hebrew one is better than the English, but you can find
Definitely.
so much
There's also
information
Wikitext,
out there.
which I would say is better. Wikidata also is something that has a huge amount.
So many things. There's so many different resources today where it's easier than ever to work on things. But like you said, also things go missing, things are wrong, they don't have everything. So
and a lot of the crowdsourced stuff. I mean, this is the problem with Wikipedia now, is that they're finding so much problematic material in Wikipedia. This came a lot up even before recent times with sources about Poland and World War II, and where there were people who were actively working to change the narrative. Yeah. And because it's a crowdsourced site, this is something, if you have enough people who are, or bots or whatever, who are willing to change the text, then that becomes the standard text. You have to be really, really, really careful. The same thing with AI. The only thing I'll say on AI is it hallucinates, obviously. You can use it as maybe a starter, but check every single word that it gives you, because it just totally lies sometimes. So there are things, I think it's worthwhile to play around with it, because it's going to continue to exist and you can't just pretend that it doesn't. But you have to be aware of it's not facts. It's just everything that's in the internet has been dumped into this. There's tons of bad stuff on the internet, false stuff on the internet. One
thing I want to add is that check every source always. So even when you have a printed Sefer in front of you, it's so important to check the sources. Even a new, nice edition.
Even
many
an
of them,
academic text, I would say.
Let's not go there.
Go back and read the source. Check the original.
Absolutely. The one thing that I'll say, I don't know if I said this on our 5-year episode, is that I really learned from the podcast and reading more and more academic books, is that you need to check the sources on every single thing. Academic books, non-academic books. And if there's no source, it's no good. And if it has a source, great. People say, well, how can you read that book or that thing from that person? Well, if it has a source, then just check it. It's not a big deal to check what's going on.
And see where it's coming from.
Same with this farm. You need to check. There's so many new editions. They add sources and whatever. And they tell you they did Hagah Meduyekes. They're full of errors and the sources are wrong. And you must check everything and see where it's coming from and make sure that it is legit. So that's always. So therefore, make sure it has sources. That's important.
I will say something that frustrates me a lot about some of the from presses is that they don't give sources. And I'm like, wait, I never knew that. Where's that information from? That's because I'm a librarian and this is my job. But also, like, wait, I want more information, which is not, I'm not saying not casting. Well, maybe I'm a little bit casting aspersions, but most of the stuff is fine. But if something seems strange, follow up. Like, do some research. It's okay.
To close out the series, hope everyone enjoyed. Thank you to Sefaria for sponsoring. We'll, of course, link to Sefaria. But what about further reading material? As you stated on this episode and throughout, there is no one book on this. We said earlier, David Amram is still a wonderful read. He writes really well. It's an enjoyable read, but it's dated. Things are wrong. Things are missing. So there's that, of course, to start. But there's obviously there's articles and books and things all over the place. But what you're not going to recommend endless articles and random things for people. But what can you just recommend if someone wanted to read up more about the history of print and they want to learn more about Jewish printing?
It's a really hard question. I mean, this is something that I'd love to, be able to just put out. I don't have the time, honestly, to do something like that myself. I know that there have been I've had some conversations with people over the last few years, and there's some discussions about possibly putting something like this together. I think one of the things, something that's come out recently, is there are a number of books about particular collections that have really interesting information. The exhibit catalog for the Rambam exhibit, for instance, that David Sklar put together has really important information about print within it. I read auction catalogs and I learn information because I buy, but also I learn information about material in my collection that I have already that I didn't know this particular story about. Shout out to Auction Chatter. I'm an avid listener to that one. But it's hard to give a single topic. I always say to people, if you're interested, I can't give you an overview. What particular topic are you interested in? And then there's lots of individual references that I would give. So I'm sort of going to dodge that question, I think.
Okay, so we'll maybe find some stuff to link to, but really there's not much, and that's kind of we're holding today. So hopefully you enjoyed this podcast series, really just scratching the surface. As with many podcasts and podcast series, I tell people this is not a substitute for reading up articles and books and really educating yourself. This is just an informative podcast, and hopefully this was informative for learning about mainly early Hebrew print, this epilogue episode. Almost an hour here, but we covered a bunch of other things.
And I would say even like as we think about books in the modern era, right, we're on a digital medium in a podcast talking about books. I think that's very meta, but also kind of appropriate as we conclude this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle, for joining me once again and throughout this mini-series. And thank you to Sefaria for sponsoring.
Thank you.